Hello, I'm Sarah Moore-Peach, one of the presenters of Here and Now, BBC Radio 3's new music programme. This is a podcast edition of Modern Muses, in which today's leading composers and performers talk about their creative collaborations.
I first met Russell Hartenberger, I guess it was about 1970 or 71. I had just come back from a trip in the summer of 1970 to Ghana to study drumming. And I had heard recordings of West African drumming and thought they were amazing, but had no idea what they were doing. And I thought, well, it's about time I did. And then I got back, and I got a telephone call from a friend up at Wesleyan University. He said, look, I have a friend by the name of Russell Hartenberger, and he wants to go to Africa, and he heard that you went there, and he wants to know what shots to get. What medical preventative shots. I said, sure, have him give me a ring. So I got a call, a very mild-mannered, very nice sort of voice guy. And I said, listen, when you're back, I'm working on this new piece that's involving, bongo drums and I think probably marimbas and maybe some other things. Please get in touch. He said, sure. And a few months later, the phone rang.
And Steve invited me to come to a rehearsal of drumming, the piece that he was composing at the time. So that was how the whole thing came together. I came to the rehearsal and was fascinated by the music.
So I showed him the basic pattern of drumming, which is, in a sense, hey, folks, that's it. That's drumming. But it goes on for an hour. Yeah, I know, but that's really it. And I said, look, you just play that pattern over and over again on tuned bongo drums, stand-mounted and played with sticks. And he started playing the pattern. I said, look, you stay put. I'm going to join you in unison, and I'm going to get slowly ahead of you. Don't follow me. He said, okay. And pretty soon we were, 1/8 note out of phase. And I thought, hey, this guy's solid as a rock. And that is Russell. Russell is solid as a rock in every respect.
It was a new experience for me in the context of Western classical music. But at the same time, I was studying African music and North Indian music and South Indian music and gamelan from Indonesia. And those experiences were actually quite similar. For example, my African drumming teacher would show me a pattern. I would imitate it and then repeat it for a very long time until I got it. And it was the same case with drumming. When I came in for a rehearsal, Steve Reich would show me my new part, play it the way he wanted it and in the place he wanted it, and I would imitate it and then repeat it until I got the hang of it.
Now, everybody pretty much accepted the fact that I did not use notation. I had the notation, but I realized that it would be, especially with musicians of this quality, much more efficacious to simply play the pattern.
He was actually composing it as we rehearsed. He would just bring in a little section of the piece at our weekly rehearsals and teach it to us by rote.
I never could have presented the performances that we Steve Reich musicians presented without the conviction and the loyalty to the music. I was young. I had a short fuse. I wasn't the most easiest guy to get along with. But I think everybody recognized that I really was. I was in it for the music. I was devoted, and musicians respond to that. They see somebody who's really. It's not some show or personality. It's a real caring that we get it right.
Steve developed a very relaxed rehearsal atmosphere in one sense. The musicians all got along well with each other. I wouldn't call him a taskmaster at all. I would call him a perfectionist. He was very interested in having us play the piece in the way that he wanted it to be played, but he didn't approach it like a dictator. It was a very sort of informal way of instructing, but yet precise.
I wrote the music, And I never changed things because people suggested it. I did, in Music for Melody Instruments, Voice and Organ, notice that everybody was kind of yawning in the third section. And that's the worst kind of musical criticism you can get. That's real musical criticism. So I trashed it and I rewrote it.
Steve was always willing to incorporate any performer's ideas or opinions into the piece if he thought they were appropriate. In fact, he would often call us at our homes in between rehearsals and ask us how we thought something went or if we thought something would work better another way. So I think it gave the ensemble members a sense of ownership with the piece, even though he was actually the composer.
You hear the and you hear, because the drums are pitched, they're tuned very carefully, that's my job. You hear these sub-patterns that are created by the interlocking of these two patterns.
The people who were performing the resultant patterns would come up with their ideas for rhythmic patterns that they thought sounded interesting, and Steve would incorporate those patterns into the piece. It's the kind of music that benefits from repeated performances and run-throughs, even in rehearsal. And we rehearsed drumming for the better part of a year. And without having to read notation, the music is embedded in you very clearly, and also you remember it for a long time.
In that kind of chamber music, which is what it is, you develop a kind of camaraderie and cooperation, since it is in the interest of all concerned to get it right, to listen carefully and to be helpful if need be. And if you do that for 30 years, you get to be like the Budapest String Quartet. I started off with 4 musicians and 8 bongo drums. And when I got to the end of the bongo section, I began to hear, well, this is a very middle register, and I somehow decided I wanted to go up from there. So I was able to get together the money to buy three octave marimbas from F to F. That's the F below middle C, 3 octaves up. And once I got the marimbas, we needed 9 players, because I wrote a more extended piece for that. And as I was playing the marimbas, and I wasn't taking any drugs or any substances at the time, I began to hear women singing. And I thought, oh, that's weird. And it began to sound like Ella Fitzgerald doing scat singing. So I thought, well, why not have real women really singing these patterns? Add women's voices to the ensemble that was going to play drumming. Eventually, there were 9 musicians playing the marimbas and 2 women's voices. So the ensemble had grown to 11 musicians. And when we got to the end of the marimba section, which took a good several months to do that, I began to think, what if the top of the marimba, was there anything that goes up from there? And I thought, well, the glockenspiel. Now, when you started playing the glockenspiels, you didn't hear any singing because you were so high, but you began to hear whistling or piccolo. And lo and behold, I became the whistler, and I began to literally, while they were playing, I would whistle patterns that were produced by the 3 glockenspiels, and eventually that patterns got even higher. So all of a sudden we had this odd ensemble, 9 percussionists, 2 women's voices, and piccolo.
So it evolved, and we kind of participated in that evolution as performers, seeing it unfold from week to week, not knowing exactly what was going to come next. So that was very exciting.
So the ethos, the aesthetic, which included a kind of I will listen to what the instruments tell me ethos, determined the instrumentation of the piece. And through all of this, Russell is the kind of commenting and giving good advice and playing away in the drums, in the marimbas, and on the glockenspiels. He plays all those instruments.
I don't think any of us realized the extent of the piece when we were rehearsing it. And I'm not sure that Steve even did.
it was definitely a landmark musically, a landmark in terms of our establishing a kind of familial relationship amongst ourselves. And out of drumming, most all of the musicians stayed put and became the hardcore Music for 18 musicians. So we began to forge a repertoire of pieces, because in the middle was 6 pianos, which is the same musicians, and music from Allen instruments, voices, and organ.
As a member of his ensemble and as a close friend, I find him extremely loyal to his performers, extremely considerate of our musical desires and opinions. I think that's been consistent through all the time that I've known him and all the various pieces that I've learned, and I value that very much.
If you work with musicians for 30 years, a lot of things become unspoken. And a recognition of excellence is also unspoken. And a big part of the success of my ensemble was that everybody honestly kind of knew where they were at. I was the least of the performers because I am the least of the performers. And everybody got that. And Russell has a sort of warm personality and a friendliness that's very approachable, very welcoming when there were new people who came in, which is also, just understood and appreciated by people around.
From the early days when I used to sleep on his couch after a long night rehearsal so I wouldn't have to drive home to my apartment in Middletown, Connecticut, he was very willing to offer career advice, have musical discussions, discuss personal situations that I had or that any other person in the ensemble had. So I felt a strong friendship even from the very beginning.
Russell's from Oklahoma. Very plain-spoken, with a kind of honesty that's not pretentious or mannered. It's just plain-spoken. And I think Russell has that perspicacity and loving-kindness, which make for a very special human being.
You've been listening to a podcast edition of Modern Muses, part of BBC Radio 3's Here and Now. You can listen live to Here and Now on Saturday nights from 10 o'clock on Radio 3, online, on digital radio and 90 to 93 FM. This is a download from the BBC. For more information and for terms of use, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 3.